I said last year when I was on a panel on this stage that it's a bit like being at a wedding. I look out at this audience and there's so many friends and loved ones in the audience. It's really nice to see you all. Of course, lots of people, we've had arguments over the years as well, so it is really like being at a wedding. Lovely to see you. And my name is Kath Dalmeny, and my job is somehow to summarise the state of play of Brexit in the next hour. Why do I say yes to these things? So my life over the last 18 months since the EU referendum has been to be completely immersed in Brexit stuff, which I never expected. So I am not necessarily an expert in all of the issues that I'll talk about, but I generally know the person who is. So as an alliance, which is what Sustain is, that's our banner at the end there, we connect with lots of people who are working on this stuff. So if I get anything wrong in the detail, please forgive me. If you know something different, stand up and say so, because this is very much about shared space. We're all navigating together, and I like the analogy of navigation because you never quite know where you are when you're navigating, but you're taking rough estimates, and that seems to be a comfortable way of approaching this whole Brexit malarkey. That's a technical word, malarkey. Where should I not walk? Was that you? Okay. So generally over the last, as I said, 18 months or so, I've been facilitating, convening about 100 or so organisations and lots of individuals who are interested in what happens when you take a system that has been working for 40 years or so roughly in the European context and you put it into a state of flux, disruption, whatever words you like to use. So beginning, I'd like to say that I think that 2018 looks set to be quite a pivotal year for food and farming policy. Not everything will be decided this year, but quite a lot will be set in train. So it's really interesting that the Right Honourable Michael Gove, get that right, will be on this stage in about an hour's time to talk about that. But it makes me feel that this year's ORFC is exceptionally well timed, and I really wanted to thank Nessie Reid. I don't think she's in the room because she's really made this platform for so many people and so many voices. No doubt Brexit will be referred to in most of the sessions at the conference, but we've been given the job as Sustain of helping the ORFC organisers, Colin, Ruth, Nessie, to run a bit that's focused on Brexit. So this is the Brexit Room programme. So I just picked out the bits from the bigger programme. Mainly that will be in the assembly room. So if you want to fill your boots with Brexit stuff, that's where we'll be. Maybe the Right Honourable Michael Gove will join us. That'd be fun, wouldn't it? So these are the issues that we'll address. Farm labour and livelihoods, post-Brexit farm support, that's the how of how post-Brexit farm support might work. Delivering public benefits from our land is kind of the why. What are we doing this for? What are we trying to achieve? And then this thing we've called the deregulation marketplace is quite a few people came forward with ideas from the audience, from the participants, for things that would like to be addressed, and we thought that that fitted under that heading of there's lots of specific issues like wildlife, water, seed policy, GM, all those things where that's not getting a lot of attention at the moment because people are dealing with the big stuff. Well, we thought we might like to dive down. By no means is that a full list of what is being affected by Brexit, as my props in a minute will attempt to explain. And I want to emphasise that Sustain is playing a stewardship role of this room. We're not trying to lead it nor to steer the conversation. This is about creating space for many voices. And not that many voices are being heard at the moment in all of the Brexit stuff, and I think that's terribly, terribly important. So just a few sort of not ground rules exactly, but a few things I just wanted to say at the beginning, that Brexit is gigantic. Every day seems to bring something new. You know, I was on Twitter last night, as one does before a conference, you know, and already Right Honourable Michael Gove is announcing all kinds of things, even overnight. Of course, there's another farming conference down the road. It's to be expected. But we can't cover everything here, so I'm focusing only on the food and farming bits. And even so, that's gigantic. Even DEFRA has said that Brexit is, for them as the ministry, Brexit will affect them most out of all of the ministries. So hence it's actually very useful we've got somebody so high profile in that ministry at the moment. I've already said I'm not a specialist in everything, but this is a broad brush. I'm painting a big picture. Get involved if you want to know more on all of the detail. As I said, we generally know the people who knows the detail in extreme level of expertise, specialism. So we can usually put you in contact with the right person. I also said in the programme, we invite you to leave your gloom and your optimism at the door. The past 18 months, especially from my point of view, watching a lot of people talk about this stuff, is it's felt like a roller coaster, sometimes quite emotional as well. And I prefer not to get too caught up in the language of dangers and opportunities, because I think that can sometimes feed that emotional tone, or also in the negativity and the positivity. I tend to use the phrase gritty possibilism. So I would invite you and invite us ourselves during these sessions to think pragmatically about what we want to achieve together and to talk about possibilities. It's a nice word to spend time with. And then I thought I would explain that there are two whopping great elephants in the room as well, which are devolved nations, what all this means for the devolved nations, and also whether any of the things we talk about in things like the agriculture bill are thrown into disarray by new trade deals. We don't know yet, hence there is a box here with lots of question marks on. Am I pointing at the right one, I believe? Does it have question marks on? It's the other one, it's this one, sorry. Hence another bucket has... I took my 3-year-old shopping the other day, and we were buying buckets together, and she said, "Mummy, is this work?" And I said, "Well, kind of." So I think she has a very strange idea of what I do for a job. So, having gone through just those basic things, this is now a slide we'll just leave up in the background from now on. So I'm going to try and explain all the things that are going on. Some of it will be pretty basic, you'll know it already from media stuff. Some of it will be specialist stuff. So please do come up and ask if you want more details, or as I say, I can connect you with the right people. So briefly, I want to touch on these things. Stage 1 negotiations, EU withdrawal bill, agricultural bill command paper, technical terms those, 25-year environment plan, fisheries bill briefly, because we're not in a fisheries conference, but there are some really interesting things to learn from it, I think. Relationships with EU institutions, the transition deal, the trade bill white paper, and trade discussions with other nations. If you want to leave now, please feel free, I won't be offended. So, very briefly, stage 1 negotiations. Again, you will know a lot of this, so apologies if any of it sounds pretty basic. But the 3 things that we had to talk to the European Union about before we would move to the next stage were the divorce bill, how much cash we pay into European coffers, the status of European citizens in this country, and Northern Ireland. Now, from the point of view of food and farming policy, I think Northern Ireland is the most interesting question. Again, of course, all those other things are interesting too, but just for the sake of this conference, because Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland will be our only land border with Europe. Therefore, all the stuff about tariffs, trade, hard boundaries, soft boundaries, all come into play in Ireland, in a place that also has the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, where everybody has to have a say in how things work. I have Irish family, so it's the cause of great discussion in my household. So it's important in terms of trade tariffs, movement of food and animals, inspections, standards, border checks, custom arrangements. There's been talk of a frictionless border with drones in the air that will check. There's been talk from the Home Office about getting volunteers to help with policing the borders because it's going to be quite expensive to do. I'm just going to point at question marks and leave it at that. It's quite complicated, but it ain't fixed yet, but something's been said to Barnier to make them say it's okay to move on to stage 2. But what I thought was quite interesting in the stage 1 deal from the point of view of food and farming is what's left out. So things like the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, what does that mean? Devolved nations, big elephant in the room. It's quite a minefield, all of that kind of stuff, because this is big politics and food and farming is living in that really big political sphere. I would really recommend, if you want to keep in touch with what's going on in Scotland, I don't know if Pete Ritchie's here from Nourish Scotland, getting on their mailing list, because it's also interesting in terms of Scotland's already got food policy and farming policy really going forward quite progressively at the moment in lots of ways. So the Good Food Nation bill, not yet published, is really interesting because that will be played out. And of course, agriculture and farming policy is a devolved matter. So there's an interesting tension there. And I don't yet know of similar groups to Nourish tracking food and farming policy in Wales and Northern Ireland. If you do know of those people, or are you doing it yourself, I'd love to hear from you. So that was just an appeal from the stage. End of stage 1 agreement. Stage 2 agreement, commencing. That's where we'll talk about trade tariffs, custom arrangements with the European Union, if we stay in the European Union or not. Again, loads of question marks. If we fail to reach a deal with the European Union, not just on trade, but on all sorts of other things, then we'll fall back to World Trade Organization standards. I'm not at all going to attempt to explain those from the stage. And in fact, every time we start talking about it, it appears more and more complicated, and also it appears lots and lots of people are not necessarily understanding it. And my colleague Vicky Hurd has brilliantly been convening with Friends of the Earth and other colleagues some meetings to help people unpack what it actually means. If you'd like to get involved, please say. So if we do strike a deal with the European Union, there's a spectrum of possibilities from the deep and special relationship that Theresa May talks about. Is she Right Honourable as well? The Right Honourable Theresa May. Right through to Canada Plus. So I'm not a specialist in these things, so we don't have time to go into this here anyway, but suffice it to say, under many of the options that are being put on the table and being discussed mainly in the media, the import and export tariffs on food and agricultural products, particularly those with some level of processing, so with meat products, if it's been killed and butchered, those tariffs can be eye-watering if we don't strike the right kind of deal. And opinions on whether moving to WTO rules or not is a good thing are legion. So it's a complex area. Hence, our second elephant in the room is trade deals, both with the EU and internationally. So I was going to ask Abby, if I've got these in the right order. Let's see. I think my bits of paper have got beautifully out of order. So I wonder if you put those. This is where I'm going to kick my buckets into action. I don't go around with buckets just for fun. I wonder if you might put that into the question mark bucket, which is new. If you show the audience what you're putting in as he goes in, that's the new EU trade deals. Thank you, Abby. Abby didn't know what she was letting herself in for when she agreed to this. That's interesting, because I want to then explain what these buckets are. Are you ready for this? There's a bank bucket. Am I pointing the right thing? Bank, build, and bin. As we come out of the European Union, lots of things are already starting to happen. That means we either keep it, the thing that we talk about, there's lots of different things on my bits of paper. We start to adapt it and build it fit for purpose for the future. This is our kind of taking back control bucket, maybe. Maybe not sometimes. And this has been, some things have already gone. We're being told all the time that some things haven't already gone, but some things have already gone. So, oh, yeah, okay. Design floor. Oh, there's a bar in the way. Perfect. Thank you, Chris. Thank you. You can see my beautiful artwork. Oh, thanks, Abby. It's brilliant. Okay. So let me do a bit about the EU withdrawal bill, brackets repeal bill. Actually, there should be even more brackets in that sentence. It's in full swing at the moment. So the House of Commons has been discussing that. This is where bank, build, and bin come into full sway. So I'm going to give Abby, lucky you, I hope these haven't got too out of order, but we shall see. This is a little bit homemade, as you can probably tell. We didn't have any budget for this. So I want to draw attention to the fact that each of these buckets has a hole in it. Not in order to start singing "There's a hole in my bucket," but to say that along with the question marks, none of these is written in stone, by any means. Things will keep on changing. Also, some things are leaking out, some things are going into the buckets in a way that it's not quite the same as it was before. So some things are also moving between these buckets. Sometimes they're being banked, kept. Sometimes they're already being talked about how we might build them, for example, how farm payments might change. And as I say, some things have already ended up in the bin. So that I'm calling for the repeal bill purposes. If you know about Henry VIII clauses, then in a way that hole in the bucket is a Henry VIII clause. What that means is, in the EU withdrawal bill, the promise of the EU withdrawal bill is that we are transferring the whole of European legislation into UK law in one go, and it will carry on functioning pretty much the same. It's to avoid the cliff edge when we actually leave. So all of those are meant to be functioning perfectly smoothly after we leave the European Union. Hence, lots of people are using this language of banking it. We're banking those standards and rules so that things will pretty much look the same the next day. The government is giving themselves something called Henry VIII powers, not necessarily a bad thing. In the process of coming over from the European Union, there'll be sentences in those legislation that need to be just tweaked a bit to make sense if they're in UK law, because it might refer to an institution, or it might refer to a process. Well, it might need to refer to an institution here, so they need the powers to be able to change the line in the legislation. The trouble is, when you open up that door to being able to do that, what else do you use it for? It's not being a conspiracy theorist or anything, but what powers have you given yourself in that process? Hence, there's been a lot of discussion in the media about those Henry VIII powers, about whether they could be curbed, have time limits, be limited to certain things. There's a wonderful organisation called the Hansard Society who are fantastic on all this stuff because they live and breathe it. They've designed a process which I think they gave to Dominic Grieve to champion called a lift and sift. Don't worry, this is technical detail. But basically, it won't all come through. There is a hole in that bucket. Things will start changing from day one. So some of them, if you would like to find, for example, the precautionary principle, the polluter pays principle, and the access to justice principle, I think probably people in this room might be most familiar with the precautionary principle. That isn't a law. It's not a European law. It's a principle that is written into one of the treaties founding the European Union. So it doesn't come across. It doesn't come across automatically unless you make a deliberate decision to. Well, nobody quite knows what's going to happen with that yet. So a couple of MPs tabled an amendment to the EU withdrawal bill to try and make that clear about what would happen to the precautionary principle, the polluter pays principle, access to justice, and that was turned away. So that amendment didn't go into the EU withdrawal bill. So the position of those principles, which are, because I hang out with some environmental lawyers, really fundamental. They get used in legal stuff all the time to make assessments about food safety, environmental standards, pesticide regulation, chemical regulation, novel foods and processes, GM, all sorts of things. So the Right Honourable Michael Gove, I must keep on getting that right, the Right Honourable Michael Gove has made promises in front of select committees that there will be an environmental body who will have some things in its remit and that a policy statement will be issued to cover this sort of stuff. I don't know what legal status a policy statement has in comparison to treaty principles. Hence, there are holes in these buckets as we go through. So I'm going to ask Abby, well, I'm going to swither a bit. Environmental principles, we don't know if they're in build. If they get kept in this environmental institution, great. If they don't, or they get changed in name, then we might lose all kinds of power of them because the legal precedent might disappear. I don't know. Lots of lawyers are swithering about this at the moment. I don't like making predictions about Brexit because it changes every day, but I'm going to put the precautionary principle in the bin. And that's only me saying that, but I just think unless we fight for it in the way that animal sentience got fought for over the last few months, it's in here. So, and also if it's changed in wording, that could be quite interesting. So I'm going to, in terms of the polluter pays, well, I mean, I don't know where it's going to go. It might go in build, it might go in, where would you like to put it? Build, or how are you feeling optimistic, in which case put it into build. Why not? Let's do some optimism. And let's actually, tell you what, let's put the precautionary principle in build as well, because I put it on 2 bits of paper with that very thought in mind, to keep that optimism going. Let's then talk, I just mentioned the principle of animal sentience. Sorry, having to sort through my bits of green paper. Another treaty principle. So this hit the media in the way the precautionary principle didn't, although there was very good debate on environment in House of Commons. Animal sentience is also a treaty principle, not in a law at the moment. Now, there was so much fuss about it, brilliantly championed by Compassion in World Farming, for example, and because there are quite a lot of MPs who care about it profoundly, the principle of animal sentience basically says an animal can feel pain and joy and suffering, therefore we need to treat them as beings in all of our policies. Good. Sorry, I'm not supposed to take a side, am I? A neutral response to animal sentience. But if in the treaty principle, that means all your rules have to be tested against it. It's a bit like equalities legislation or disability legislation. So there was so much fuss, and it got even down to young people using Instagram, that I think that gave the groundswell of a movement that brought it very near to that vote going awry for the government. So actually there's been quite a lot of concessions. So although it was very controversial, the way that it was dealt with in the media and things like that, and there were some claims in all directions, I think the animal sentience thing was fantastic in that it raised an issue high enough for it to be, for concessions and promises to be made. The promise is there'll be a new Animal Welfare Act. So I'd like to put principle of animal sentience firmly in build, because it has been noticed. And I think there might be one with new Animal Welfare Act on it somewhere. It's probably got little stars around it because it's a new thing rather than an old thing. As I said, things are changing already. New Animal Welfare Act, thank you very much. I'll put that in build. Thank you very much. Got an optimistic bucket building up here. EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. Anybody even heard of it? Yay, thank you very much. I had not before I started working on Brexit. I had literally no idea that isn't it? It's a wonderful document, in my opinion. I read it for the first time about a year ago and did not realise that I had been living under those rights as a citizen of Europe and citizen of Britain. Thank you. An expert here. Thank you so much. Do you want to say anything else about it while you're... Actually, do better. The microphone. Since you know about it, I'd be delighted.
Really close.
Okay. The European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights builds on the European Convention of Human Rights, but it goes much further.
Yeah.
It includes social, economic, workers' rights, which are not in the original charter. It's also modernised a lot of rights, because the original charter comes from the 1950s, and our thinking on things like equality, sexuality, animal rights, lots of thinking has moved on since then. So the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights is a wonderful document that we should fight tooth and nail to incorporate into our law.
Fantastic. I'm so glad you stood up to say that. Thank you. As I say, I did not know I was living under those rights before. I feel quite moved when I read it because it's rather a beautiful document as an expression of how we should be to each other as human beings. I'm really sorry to say, but it's looking like it's going in the bin. Now, but not if we fight. So there's lots of wonderful lawyers and human rights people who are fighting for it. It underpins lots of stuff like consumer protection, data access, all the sorts of things that actually are terribly important for people working on policy. If there's one thing you do when you go away from here, go and read it. As I say, it's on the website, fully there. Government has issued a paper saying that all the rights are adequately covered within UK law, partly because they don't want to be defeated in a vote, I think. And as far as I can tell, and I'm no human rights lawyer, but I do hang out with human rights lawyers, they'd say that's not true, and there are lots of things specifically like children's rights that are in there. That lady's nodding there, thank you very much. Of course, very controversially, the freedom of movement is also in there. So that's the bit that makes it very particularly awkward in the context of people feeling uncomfortable about migration. That's part of the Brexit vote, we assume, not that anybody's ever asked. And highly relevant to farmers, of course, hence we have a session on farm labour, who's going to pick the crops. Because if the freedom of movement goes, which it probably will, then what happens? So I've said, have we actually put it in the bin yet? I actually can't bear putting it in the bin. I'm going to cry while I do it, but I think it's going in the bin. So it was defeated, and the government's position is it's adequately covered by UK law. The EU withdrawal bill also doesn't cover, oh, there's a tiny thing, what's it called? The Common Agricultural Policy. And, although not related to food and to farming, the Common Fisheries Policy. Nor indeed, elephant in the room, international trade. We'll come to that later. So I would, if you've got, Abby, the Common Agricultural Policy and the Common Fisheries Policy, and here we are. I'm not putting them in the bin, I'm just going to put them in the question mark box, if that's all right. Question mark box, thank you very much. So kind. Sorry I'm doing this to you. You can take it out on me later. So just a bit of a characterisation of the House of Commons, because sometimes when you watch the House of Commons debates on telly, you just get the big names having a go at each other. And I went in and sat in on some of the sessions just as a normal citizen wanting to go and see. And I thought it was really interesting because lots of people like yourself were standing up and championing bits of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights and then being told flat no. No, we're not going into detail yet. We want to get this bill through. You can see the thrust of it in a way. So I'd say that much of what has been fought over in Parliament in the EU withdrawal bill so far has been broadly about the Henry VIII powers and what some people, including the House of Lords, who've done analysis of it, a power grab, because if you give yourself powers to do things, it's a bit like a power grab, and constitutional matters. Parliament is rightly concerned about itself and its own status as we take back control. Big elephant in the room, of course, the devolved nation. Who's taking back control? Is it Westminster? Well, Scotland's got something to say about that. Northern Ireland's got something to say about that, if they had a government at the moment. These things are huge, and they are about kind of big historical things, and sometimes the food and farming side of it, precautionary principles, charter rights, all these things can get lost, I think, in the discussion. So the big things that have really been fought over, as we've seen in the media, are Parliament's right to vote on the final Brexit deal and things like that. All of this can sound quite arcane, so it's worth giving some indication. I just wanted to bring out a few real things, rather than these overarching principles, of how some very influential people in government would like to see government using those powers. So, about a year ago, Ian Duncan Smith, is he right honourable? Yes. Thank you for letting me check. The Right Honourable Ian Duncan Smith. Is Nigel Lawson right honourable? Thank you. I have an expert at the back. Nigel Lawson MP and others made it clear that they would... oh, he is. Lord Lawson. Oh, Lord. I was one of the people who complained about his coverage on climate change. I will admit that from the stage. Awful. Anyway, so about a year ago, Ian Duncan Smith and Nigel Lawson, I will just use their names, they're people, and others made it clear that they would expect to see 5 EU rules axed as soon as possible. They did it in the Telegraph, so they were clear about it. And these were, let me say this to this room, the Habitats Directive, the Renewable Energy Directive, the Energy Efficiency Directive, the Working Time Directive, and any rules that prevent bent bananas. Because they know their media, this lot. Right, so I'm saying that there's a strong possibility, thank you very much, Abby, you're a genius. There's a strong possibility they aren't going in the bin yet, are they? EU Habitats Directive, there's going to be a big fight, isn't there? But there's a possibility, so we'll put a possibility of it going in the bin. But you can see that if you give yourself powers, there's also some people beginning to go, ooh, now, if we had those powers, what could we do with them? You know, some of the debate, this is why the EU withdrawal, why I'm going on about the EU withdrawal bill, is it's really important for some principles later about what powers people have, whether they have to check with Parliament, whether it needs to go into a manifesto promise so that we can all examine it. If our country wants to get rid of the Habitats Directive at some point, that's a democratic issue. It shouldn't be decided behind closed doors, is my opinion. So there are some other unanswered questions. For example, some of the amendments that MPs were championing, sometimes to raise trouble, sometimes to genuinely try and get them into this bill, were about the UK's relationship with EU institutions, processes and functions. We'll come back to that in a minute. But you'll probably have heard the stuff about the European Court of Justice, whether or not the Supreme Court of the European Union has a say on the stuff that we decide. But also, equally importantly, probably more importantly for this room, things like the European Food Safety Authority, the European Medicines Agency, which covers both human and veterinary medicines. I'll come back. Very briefly, what next? The EU withdrawal bill has finished its first stage in the House of Commons. It's now going to go to the House of Lords, and I'm reliably informed that we now describe this as a ping-pong match. Or maybe if Boris gets to be in charge, a whiff-waff match. Going backwards and forwards between House of Lords and Commons with amendments and discussions and debates and mud-slinging and all sorts of things. So it should be fun. What I would recommend is getting on the list of Unlock Democracy, who is doing a lot of coordination around the repeal bill. And they are fantastic people and work with the Hansard Society. I'll put up some contact details later and ask Nessie if she can be circulating them. So let me get to the agriculture bill. And you'll be very pleased to hear it won't be me talking about this. I'm going to ask Vicky Hurd from Sustain. Where are you, Vicky? Oh, you're at the front. Sorry, I've been looking at you. Have you got a microphone so that you can do? But I will just say a couple of things before I start on it. So crucially for ORFC, what replaces the Common Agricultural Policy, farm payments, rural development policy and funds, has not yet been decided, as we know. Some of it's being discussed down the road at the moment and will be brought into this room very shortly by an eminent gentleman with Right Honourable His Lordship things. So 2 sessions of our Brexit room will focus on this very important question, because obviously it's gigantic for us all. But looking both at, again, just to repeat what I said earlier, looking at what future public funding should pay for and how such funding should be best organised. I understand that Right Honourable Michael Gove has said this morning he'd like people to be able to apply for farm payments within a single day. So those kind of things that will be being discussed. It's due any day now, the agricultural bill, but it keeps moving. Everything in Brexit keeps moving, so it was going to be January, it was going to be last year, it could be by the end of the year, we don't know. We'll do our best to keep up with it. And it's obviously complicated by any trading relationships we engage in with the European Union, or transitional relationships, or in new international trade discussions that we have. However, I will now pass over to Vicky to give insights on what's going on.
Kath, can you all hear me okay? Well, It's fascinating. I've just been trying very quickly to read against copy the Gove speech this morning. I don't know. Has anybody else managed to read it? Really, really, really interesting reading. And I would recommend everybody have a look, because I honestly say, I'm sure Patrick would agree, we've not seen such a speech at the Oxford Farming Conference from a Secretary of State the like. It's quite extraordinary in its scope and its vision, I have to say, from the Secretary of State. But as Kath said, we do have two sort of phases in a way. We have a transition phase and then thinking longer term. And now, because of what Gove said, and also because what is being agreed in Europe in terms of the withdrawal agreement, as opposed to the withdrawal bill, the withdrawal agreement, what will the European member states agree to in terms of the transition phase, or as the Secretary of State says today, the implementation phase? He seems to be using both words interchangeably, and it's rather confusing in terms of what that actually means for farmers, in terms of what they'll have to comply with, but also how long it is. And I'm already getting very mixed messages on the Twitter sphere this morning. Is it till 2024? Is it till 2020? And I don't think it's absolutely clear yet whether we will see after 2019 farmers having a very, very different payment scheme until the transition phase is over, or will we have something very similar? And that very much depends on what member states will put up with in terms of being access of our produce to the European market under a different regime. But the transition phase, as I said, is very much in play at the moment in terms of discussions, and will depend on what happens with the withdrawal agreement. But longer term, Secretary of State has made absolutely clear, agreeing with what our members have said for a long time, that payments should be based on a public goods approach. And he's actually described a lot of those public goods this morning in quite a lot of detail and in quite a wide scope. So it includes rural communities and rural livelihoods. It includes all the environmental goods that we'd be interested in seeing, including soil health, including nature, wildlife, habitats, meadows, forests, awful lot that we'd be interested in this room, I would have thought, in ORFC, but paying farmers to be able to deliver those things. Interestingly, he's also talking about making sure that we don't have perverse outcomes. And he is talking about capping subsidies so that all the money doesn't go to the larger farms, something that Sustain, from its inception many years ago, has been calling for in order to allow the money to be better targeted. Sorry, Kath, I'll go on too long. So how that targeting will happen? Will we have ring fencing? Will the design of the schemes allow us to make sure that farmers can access the money they need to deliver the outcomes that we are asking for as the public? That's all to play for, and very, very exciting times. So I think finally I would say what is most important is for everybody to get involved in the debates, and how long those debates will run for is up for play now. Is it 6 years? Is it 2 years? But we, as Kath said, we will have a command paper, I'm told, by the end of spring, by DEFRA at the moment, so we'll have something to look at. And a command paper is slightly different from a white paper, and it is more consultative, this is what I'm told. So get involved, and I'm told there will be a digital participatory engagement with the public. So please get involved in that. I'm sure you all will anyway, but ask your friends, your neighbours, your families to engage with that consultation process from DEFRA, to speak to people, talk to people about what they want from farming, and get the ordinary general public involved. That is absolutely crucial. And we'll be updating people. We've got a mailing list that you can join. We'll give you all the updates and what's happening where and when. So I think that's it. But just the most crucial point is to get involved in the consultation ahead and read Gove's speech.
Thank you. You can keep that. Thank you very much. I'll take the opportunity to say from the stage, one of the best things about Brexit is that we got Vicky back at Sustain. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, probably enough on the agricultural bill. As I said before, if you want to fill your boots with more agriculture bill stuff, then come and join us in the Brexit room, which is the assembly room in the sessions following. I'll now move on to the 25-year environment plan, which has been due shortly for as long as I can remember. So putting due shortly in quotes there was my little slightly sarcastic thing about those. Right Honourable Michael Gove is obviously saying lots of good stuff about environment at the moment, has already done some things like reinforcing the neonicotinoid ban, reintroducing beavers, prioritising environment. I had down here capping farm area payments, but I see from this morning that's kind of like put a little bit later down the line. Still there as a possibility. So the environment stuff is really interesting, and I wondered if there was somebody in the audience who might want to update us, perhaps from Greener UK or Wildlife and Countryside link. Otherwise, I'll do my slightly ham-fisted version of it. Fine, in other sessions, that's not a problem. They've probably been hearing about too much about Brexit already. So, what I'll just say is that the 25-year environment plan is still being awaited, and we're hoping that that will be a kind of policy statement on which good things can be built. So let's put the 25-year environment plan in firmly in build. Lots of NGOs of the kind of wildlife, environment, climate change, biodiversity, farmland, water, all kinds of stuff, people have been getting together for a good long while. Lovely colleague Matt Dunwell from Bug Life is here, who'd been chairing that process to look at possibilities for a new Environment Act. Some of this stuff will need to be written down in new legislation, partly because these buckets have holes in. So that is probably going to have to kick off again fairly soon. There's no schedule for it, but that's something to watch, I think. The idea that we might coalesce behind some legislation that would put this environmental stuff on a really secure footing, given that some of those treaty principles might be gone. We need some very good foundations for environmental governance in the future. So if that could go in build as well, that would be great. And I'm going to put the policy statement for the new environmental body or the new environmental approach also into build. Again, one to watch. What gets said there, which things get referenced, what language is used, what legal status it has, will all be terribly important. So that's, have we got a 25-year food and farming plan there? No, we haven't, have we? Let's put that one in the bin. It's gone. Basically, I think it's been overtaken by events, really, hasn't it? But it's interesting, because quite a lot of us put quite a lot of effort into that as a possibility of having a new approach to food and farming. But the 25-year food and farming plan, gone. Don't even bother talking about it anymore. That's a whistle-stop tour of the environment stuff. The Greener UK and Wildlife and Countryside link has two alliance organisations who have been doing a great job of getting people together to talk about that, and we're part of that. It's been one of the wonderful things over the last 18 months that people have been opening doors, talking to each other, sharing resources, sharing ideas. We're sort of creating language and approaches together, which is fantastic. So again, get involved with those people, should you wish. I am going to touch on the fisheries bill now. I didn't highlight it in bold because it's not so directly relevant here, but I think a bit like animal sentience, I think there's some things to learn from it. And I do work a lot on fisheries, and I'm very interested in sustainable fish. Partly because, a bit like soil, it's one of the indicators that things are going quite wrong with the natural system, and that we need to act differently as human beings in relationship to it. And that has to be into our culture, into our buying practices, into our laws, into our funding systems. So I love working on fisheries partly because it is so clear about some of the things that should happen. So I think some of the things worth watching in the fisheries bill process, fisheries bill is also on this piece of elastic. We're not sure quite when it's coming out. It was due out in December, didn't see it. We did meet the poor chap from DEFRA who's writing it, and he looked like a rabbit in headlights, poor chap, because it is a gigantic thing to cover. So this is a place where the crisis has been acknowledged in terms of ecological limits, and built into policy already to a certain extent. So we'll be looking for things like maximum sustainable yield legislation. We'll be looking for marine protected areas. These are things which, if those get through, then we've got some hope in the farming front as well, that those kind of ways of thinking can get through as well on soil, bees, water. But of course, there's a lot of furore about it as well, because it's hugely political. So it'll be really interesting to see whether the economic interests of the SME fishers, the smaller fishers, really can survive through that process. New Economics Foundation has just done a report which suggested that smaller scale fishers will lose out. Thank you. So how serious are government about supporting SMEs? This is a bit of a litmus test, I think, the fisheries bill. And as I said, huge political hot potato, fish finger, one of those things, but also perceived as quite a low-value bargaining chip in the economics, which I find ghastly to say, but it's considered something that could be part of negotiating assets away. So that tension of natural assets either being owned by other people or shared with other nations and being part of the political shenanigans, again, another technical word, shenanigans, is really interesting to watch, I think. Also, tensions of different standards. Another elephant in the room, trading partners. What do trading partners think about our maximum sustainable yield and sustainability criteria? Well, that might be under threat from new trade deals when we come to it. So I'm going to ask Abby to put the fisheries bill into the build bucket. Why not? We'll see, optimistic about the possibilities. So then we come to relationship with EU institutions. Again, if you want to leave now, that's absolutely fine. This is technical stuff. So tomorrow, the 2 sessions, remember I had a session here which was lots of specific issues with quite a few voices speaking. Tomorrow, 2 sessions of the Oxford Real Farming Conference, Brexit Room, Assembly Room, will examine the question of EU institutions, processes, functions. We're calling this the deregulation marketplace because there has been a trajectory for deregulation anyway in the UK, and Brexit is another opportunity to continue that trajectory. So we will be sharing insights on threats and opportunities in terms of those specific issues: wildlife, water, seed policy, GM, synthetic biology, pesticides, food waste for animal feed. That's when we get, and farm animal welfare. So when we get down into the detail on those issues. They're by no means everything. They're selected issues by who wanted to present. As I say at the beginning, Brexit is gigantic, both in scope and detail, especially for food and farming. So we just wanted to give you a flavour. The point is that we don't yet know how most of such food and farming standards will be governed. This is a kind of governance question. EU institutions, as they stand now, I don't really like calling them EU institutions. There are institutions. We were part of setting a lot of them up, and we've certainly been involved in the policy-making process. So the institutions that we're currently part of, some of them sit in Europe, some of them sit in London, I would say that policymakers have as yet given scant indication of whether we will continue to work with established EU approval processes, institutions, governance functions, or whether these will need to be recreated in the UK, brackets, at vast expense. Again, this is a big political hot potato, and I think there was something in Right Honourable Michael Gove's speech this morning about bringing down inspections on farms. Obviously, that sense of all inspections and standards being about red tape and must get rid of them will be bound up in this. But once again, I'd like to say that this is pesticide approvals, antibiotics policy in farm animals, it's chemical approvals and registries of databases of different chemicals and compositional information. It's about discussion about trading arrangements, and quite a lot of industry bodies want to stay in them. So, for example, the European Chemical Industry Association wants to stay in REACH, which is, because they say that's their gateway to being able to trade. It's part of the smooth boundary process. And we've all invested lots of our money and time into things like REACH. So I think most people want to stay in it. But of course, that is part of what happens with the deal with Europe. Can we? Would we continue to contribute to its budget? Like Norway, do we have to set up our own and have some relationship with it? None of that's really been addressed. And I think that's possibly why DEFRA's having to hire about 600 people at the moment to try and go into the detail of these kind of things. Because it's big. It's really big. Oh, look, I even wrote that on my bit of paper. This is big. Many are calling this the governance gap. So that's a phrase that I've picked up from others. And as I say, it's European Food Safety Authority, it's European Medicines Agency, European Chemicals Agency, REACH Framework. Tim Lang's just walked in, you did that wonderful report that kind of listed all of the different institutions that we'll need to work out the relationship with. Who will gather and assess data? Who will decide on standards? How will they decide on standards? Will they be democratically accountable? Who gets to comment? Who will pay for the staff and processes? They do cost a lot. So Abby, I'm going to put the governance gap, you might have governance gap there, I'm going to ask you to put that in the big questions, because I haven't heard yet really substantial stuff about how that's all going to work. And I really wanted to reinforce the idea that that comes in the context of UK policy that has been trying to deregulate quite a lot already. So many of the standards, I think I forgot to put into the original bank bucket, I will put them in now, are many of the standards that come from our relationship to the European Union. Again, that we were all involved in making. But these are the 1,000 or so laws that will need to be changed in the process of the EU withdrawal bill, and a lot of them are to do with food and farming. Agriculture, pesticides, baby food standards, workers' rights, air pollution, I'm not going to read them all, don't worry, fisheries, scientific research, food safety, habitats, data sharing, lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of things. These are the 1,000 bits of legislation. Well, you know, who's looking after all of that for us? It could be the Food Standards Agency. Well, it's diminished in budget and staffing quite a lot recently. Is there a number for it, Tim? I was looking to see if there was an actual kind of percentage decrease or something like that. From 7 floors of a building to 1. So unless they've got the kind of stocking density of a lot of chickens. Also, there are half the number of trading standards officers over the last 9 years. Environmental health officers been cut back a lot. They're paid for by local authorities. Ooh, local authorities don't have much money at the moment. Are they going to prioritise learning about how to deal with EU legislation, border control? I had a meeting with environmental health officers, trading standards officers, port health people who are all going, we're already cut by half, and then we're going to get all this stuff as well. We have no idea how that's happening. And when they go to talk about that with policymakers, people are busy with Henry VIII clauses. This is a very strange context to be in. It's all up in the air, and there's not been... So I'm going to put... You've got good food governance there, which is a pompous phrase. Why don't we have half of it in the build bucket? I put 2. Half of it in the build bucket and half of it in the bin bucket, because half of it's gone already. So I didn't want to be too optimistic about that, because I think there's an awful lot of stuff to be done on this governance stuff. Thank you very much, Abby. And it costs lots of money, and it's a political hot potato. Nobody wants Brexit to mean more expense. Well, we have got lots of jobs to do. Transition deal. I'm not going to talk about this too much. There's not much to say on it yet, to be honest. But here's a thought. So this is something I'm extemporizing a little here, but if we enter into a transition deal with the European Union, which basically means staying in the European Union, possibly with a few more freedoms to do some of the things for a few more years, what's the agriculture bill for that's about to be coming out? Could be coming out this month, might come out. It's billed as being, so I keep using the word bill, an agriculture bill is being put forward as the place in which we can start talking about taking back control. It's arguably the first place we're starting to demonstrate that. Well, if we're staying in, we might have to stay in common agricultural policy and all the payment mechanisms and all of the... There's a few commentators who are saying that. Or we might be giving ourselves the freedoms to come out partially so that we can start talking about environmental benefits in a new way and getting rid of 3 crop rules or whatever it is that we would like to do as a country. But that transition deal, I think, is really interesting because it's about to what extent we can do this taking back control thing. Hence, I followed a lot of the fisheries people who are already going, I want to be out, I want to claim back my fishing rights. And they might not be able to for a few years. So I think the transition deal is contextual stuff about to what extent any of this gets going in any near future. When ministers and secretaries of state might have changed by 2024. These things happen, don't they? So who's the next person? Do we get Andrea Leadsom back again? Will she be making a policy next? I don't have her on a piece of paper, don't worry. Watch this space, I'll leave it to that. So can we put transition deal into the question marks box? Then I'm going to come to, just got a little bit left, so trade bill white paper. So there has been a trade bill white paper, and white paper is the bit where government sets out what their plans are so that people can consult on it. That's quite funny, actually, because this white paper came out the next day after the consultation had closed, so they can't have taken into account much from the consultation. But it's not about future trade deals. It is about the existing ones that we already have within Europe and our relationship to them. So I will acknowledge here that we're not really working on that, partly because there's only a few of us, so we can't do everything. But we're focusing on future trade deals, because that's the bit where standards will come into discussion, hence the big elephant on trade bills. So I'm going to leave the trade bill white paper for now, but I think people might use it a bit like the animal sentience thing for some organising around principles about whether or not there's parliamentary scrutiny of trade stuff, whether or not we get to have a say in things, whether the power grab applies to it, all that stuff. So it's quite constitutionally based. But trade discussions, and I'm not saying trade negotiations, because we're not allowed to do that yet because we're not out of Europe. But trade negotiations and discussions are beginning to start happening. And I think that is where it's very interesting in terms of food and farming standards. And I think that is probably, if I could make that elephant with trade deals on it bigger, that's probably the biggest elephant in the room. Because for whatever anybody says now about maintaining high standards and it's great British values and high animal welfare and stuff, when it comes to a trade deal, different discussions are in the room, generally behind closed doors, and we won't get to see them for years until it's all done and dusted, unless we all stick up for the idea that there should be scrutiny over those things. And they could completely conflict with all the things we're trying to achieve in this room, or they could be complementary. I'll use one example. In the United States, per animal use of farm antibiotics is twice that of per animal antibiotic use in the UK in farming. If we enter into a trade deal, do we choose to support the kind of farming that uses twice as much antibiotics? Or do we say, actually, we have antibiotic standards for the kind of things we choose to put our money into? Who decides that? And do they decide it behind a closed door? And who do they have to report to? What are the red lines for those kind of discussions? So I think, this is me speculating a bit, but I think at the moment there's a powerful tension between two narratives, two stories going on in government policy world. The promise is to take back control, means championing British farming, high standards UK, fantastic. The second looks internationally for new trade, could be fantastic, I'm not against trade, but it tends to come with a narrative of ultra cheap food, and we know that with very cheap food, somebody pays. It isn't necessarily the consumer pays, but the farmer might, the environment might, the animal might, in some way, the food worker. And many of the standards that we hold dear in this room can be characterized as a barrier to trade and as a cost raiser. So that's the kind of context we'll be getting into once we get to trade deals. So that's not just me being a conspiracy theorist or not. Wilbur Ross, who is the head of commerce for the US, gave a talk to the CBI, the Confederation of British Industries, back in October, and he said, if you want a trade deal with us, you need to accept our product standards. So it ain't just me saying it. So I'm going to ask you, this is speculative, so here we go, I'm not saying this is going to happen, I'm going to ask you to take the bucket of standards, which is in bank, and I want to put you to take a handful, I want you to put them in the bin. Doesn't matter which ones. Or shall I do it? Oh, we haven't put them in there yet, have we? Okay. I haven't even put them in there, because the EU withdrawal bill's not gone through. Okay, if you put them in there, that is where all the standards are going in the EU withdrawal bill at the moment. So they're being banked reliably, no holes in the bucket, it's all fine, everybody. And then we come to potential future new trade deals and head of commerce for the US saying you'll have to accept our product standards. Take a random handful of those and put them in the bin, please. Thank you very much. And it's not yet clear what trade narrative will win. Who will decide? To what extent will that be open to public scrutiny? There could be a new trade act. We could have a policy paper like with the environment saying, of course, it will all be open to, we'll have standards on antibiotics, we'll have standards on animal welfare, we'll have standards on food contamination, food safety, GM, all the things that people will be discussing between these walls. Quite a nice question to ask Right Honourable Michael Gove when he comes in. To what extent can he defend those standards in the context of deals that are done by a different department? I mean, it was really quite fun seeing the chlorine-dipped chicken debate because it showed these two narratives right next to each other. We want trade deals. What do we accept? So let me finish. I think we're coming to... Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I do want to give a chance if anybody wants to clarify. I want to say that we're trying to bring at Sustain, which is the Alliance for Better Food and Farming, so a lot of the organisations who are here today are members of Sustain, not everybody, but people who are interested in healthy, ethical, sustainable food, farming and fishing, are interested in how we can respond and relate to all of this in a coordinated way. So with apologies to the People's Food Policy, because I really liked their lovely rainbow diagram, so I was trying to find a way of just expressing this complexity in a simple way, and I just thought that it is rather beautiful to use colours, because we're trying to be optimistic, that we're organising under themes that are all interrelated, so sustainable farming, sustainable fishing, food standards and safety, good food for everyone, so that is tackling the food prices thing head on to make sure that we don't forget that lots of people a lot of people are struggling to eat at the moment. International trade International development, I haven't talked a lot about here, but we will have a trade session as one of the final sessions of the Brexit room tomorrow afternoon. Thank you very much. And good food governance, which should really be in all of it, but I haven't found a way of doing that in the diagram yet. I knocked this up on Paintbox. So good food governance is very much about the stuff to do with institutions and rules and environmental health officers and trading standards people and all the, the people who look after us, the food police. Somebody once called me the food police on the radio, and they said, "Oh, you're just the food police." And I thought, well, actually, that's quite a compliment. The police keep us safe. They look after our property. They come, they turn up if you need them, if you're being attacked. I quite like being policed on food because somebody's looking after us. So I wear the badge with pride. Why not? If you want to get involved in any of those elements, it is gigantic. But the more you learn about it, I was not a Brexit specialist at the beginning of this whole process, but the more you get into it, the more you realise what's at stake and how much of this taking back control matters for food and farming. As DEFRA has acknowledged, it is the biggest, they are the ministry with the biggest impact in terms of the Brexit stuff, because so much that they deal with in terms of trade, food standards, farming, payments, subsidies, all these things are part of that portfolio. So the last thing I'd like to finish on is to echo exactly what Vicky said, which is to get involved. This is the time when joining up matters, I think. And that's, somebody said, which made me feel quite, a lovely Pete Ritchie from Norwich said, this is what Sustain was made for. And I thought, blimey, what a time to be alive. To get together to sort out what we think in order that we can come out fighting. I don't like using fighting analogies, but sometimes they're needed. So here are some ways to get involved. Don't worry, you don't have to write this down. You can photograph it if you like. I'll leave it up afterwards. But these are brilliant people who are doing some of that coordination work. Sustain doesn't do all of it by any means. There's Greener UK, there's Wildlife and Countryside Link, there's lovely Unlock Democracy doing stuff on the repeal bill, which gets quite specialist and parliamentary. I'll make sure that Nessie makes this available online afterwards as well if you want it, but do photograph if you like. And I will just finish on what I think joining up means with my favourite little animation. I once had a budget when I worked for an NGO. I don't often have budgets, but I was able to commission some animation. So don't worry, I'm not showing some film if you're AV people. When you get active on your own, you're shouting on your own. What I like to think is that if we all care about this stuff, and I really do think lots of people do in this room and are fabulous champions of lots of issues, I really huge respect for everybody's knowledge and activity. But this is what we should be doing. Lots of us getting together and doing it in a, this is synchronized crossness maybe, but a real sense of this is the time to get active. 2018 is it. Lots of things we'll be talking about will be in the future, 2024 for changes to cap payments, all that kind of stuff. But the principles, the structure, the architecture of it will start now. So we need to be involved in shaping that. Every word, every line in the legislation will matter sometime down the future. So thank you very much. I hope you've got something from a very whistle-stop tour. I apologise for just downloading at you. That's 18 months worth of Brexit. So I hope the slightly mad buckets helped to navigate it a bit. We've got a stall in the corner of the room. If you want to come up and ask any questions, please do. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the marvellous conference. Thank you very much. Can I just introduce you? Is that all right? I'd just like to introduce Sue Pritchard, who's here, who's heading up the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission work at the RSA. I've been greatly honoured to be asked to be part of the commission, and I think that is creating the space to give the mandate for change and some of these concerns to be expressed. I don't know if you want to say something from the floor. It's just, having Sue here is nice to give her the chance to say hello.
Real pleasure to be here. I just want to... Better? Yeah. So real thrill and excitement for me to be here for a whole heap of reasons, not least because as well as heading up the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, I'm an organic and permaculture farmer at home in Wales, so I'm here with many hats on. But in terms of building on what Kath has just said, the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission has been established by a very significant grant from the Esme Fairbairn Foundation to inspire and build a mandate for change for more sustainable food and farming systems in this time post-Brexit. And I think we've been doing lots of setup in the last few months. The Commission's first meeting is in fact next week. So we've been doing a lot of establishment and getting started, putting our team together. But it's given us time to focus on what we think is really important and what we think we can do to make a particular contribution alongside all the other fantastic work that people are doing in this room and indeed elsewhere. The first is to put some effort into that joining up process, the conversations that need to take place between those often siloed policy areas which have deeply interconnected relationships and connections that often get lost between food systems and farming systems and environmental systems and public health systems, housing, trade, infrastructure, and so on. Too often they get siloed. Interventions in one part of that system have unintended consequences elsewhere, and we need to put more effort into better quality joined up conversations. Government does not have a good track record in that space, and so doing some really concerted effort there I think is important. The second thing I think we can contribute is focus on that question, whose voices count. There are very many players who are quite rightly working very hard to get their members or their interest groups' voices heard at this really critical time. As a commission, we have a mandate to engage citizens and the public in raising the quality of conversations about these really important issues, and we're going to be investing a lot of resource and time and effort into doing that, I think, in quite creative ways. The third thing I want to say is that, and this is very exciting actually, but also really quite challenging. It seems to me that the case for change is now made. Over at the other conference, at the Oxford Farming Conference, the theme is embracing change. Here, change is a topic that is part of our meat and drink, our everyday experience. The case for change is made, but the real challenges come in how we bring those about. What does that actually mean in terms of policy development, in terms of practice development? So as a commission, what we're going to be focusing on is a call for solutions. I don't think we need to build that case for change any longer. I think we can accept the enormous evidence base that things need to be different. But what we really do need to work on are practical and radical proposals that enable us to really embrace the opportunities that our current political climate offers us. And so we'll be putting out, not a call for evidence, which commissions typically do, but we're going to be putting out a call for solutions. And we're going to be looking for people to suggest and propose to us things that we can explore, develop, and work through in real time over the next 18 months to really put into some practice those huge policy challenges that the Minister is going to describe again shortly. So I shall look forward very much to hearing from folk in this room and indeed elsewhere about what we might be doing.